And like I tell people, John Moses Browning, great guy, but he wasn't talented enough to build a revolver, and we'll just leave that there. Anyway.
Bringing you law, gospel, and guns. Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio, a show about guns, hunting, competition, and the natural right of self-defense, and what God's Word says about the issues surrounding gun rights and gun ownership. I'm your host, Lloyd Bailey, the Armed Lutheran, and this is episode number 83, brought to you by Cook's Holsters, American-made custom Kydex holsters with a lifetime warranty and a 100% satisfaction guarantee, cooksholsters.com. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us again this week and making Armed Lutheran Radio a part of your week. We've got a great show for you, got a lot of content. Aaron Israel addresses the protests that have sprung up around the country recently in his Fundamental Defense Tips segment this week. Sergeant Bill is talking about pre-stage rituals when you're getting ready to shoot a stage at a match. And Pastor Bennett is sharing his thoughts on our duty to help our neighbor and balancing that with our primary responsibility to protect our families and ourselves. Now, if you're a revolver shooter, or if you've got an interest in revolvers or in becoming a revolver shooter, well, today's special guest is going to be a treat. When you think revolver, you probably think Samuel Colt, who was granted the first U.S. patent for his single-action revolver back in 1835, and for whom it was said, God made man, but Samuel Colt made all men equal. Well, the idea for the multi-chamber firearm, the revolver essentially, dates back to the 16th century, but Samuel Colt was the first to mass produce them in the 19th, and that technology continues today. In this age of polymer wonders and single-stack 9mm that are so easy and comfortable to carry, the revolver still has a place in competition, concealed carry, and self-defense. Personal Defense Network contributor, author, and instructor Grant Cunningham will be here to talk about wheel guns today, so stick around. We've got a ton of great info for you on the show. You're listening to Armed Lutheran Radio on the Self-Defense Radio Network.
The Self-Defense Gun Stories podcast is for people who are thinking of getting a gun, and for those who already own one. Each week we invite a firearms instructor to discuss the news. At Self-Defense Gun Stories, we study responsible gun owners who protected themselves and the people they love. Were these gun owners lucky, or were they properly trained and prepared? What would you do if you were in their shoes? What should you do? Come listen at selfdefensegunstories.com.
It's time for this week's self-defense tip from Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense.
Hey folks, this is Aaron Israel with Fundamental Defense, here with your personal defense tip of the week. Unless you've been living in a cave or on Mars or have checked out from watching the news or checking your social media, and I wouldn't blame you for doing so, you probably noticed that tensions are getting kind of high in our country right now. Left versus right animosity is being stirred up and encouraged by forces inside the liberal media and by lunatic fringe groups on both sides of the fence, with Antifa and then with the alt-right on the other side. One of the ways we're seeing this play out is that people are taking to the streets like it's 1965 to exercise their First Amendment right to assemble and to protest or speak in favor of whatever the cause du jour happens to be at that moment in time. Right now we're having a debate about what statues should stand or be removed, but tomorrow it'll be something else, and then the day after that something else, whatever the media wants to use as a battering ram at that point in time. For those of you who are outraged with the current political situation or just fed up or experiencing whatever emotion you're experiencing, I implore you, if you care about personal defense, Don't express your outrage by getting involved in these protests and counter-protests in the public square, whatever your position may be. The violence at these things is only going to get worse as our country grows more polarized, and I don't want you to get caught in the middle of it. You don't want you to get caught in the middle of it. If you live near a major metropolitan area and you know one of these demonstrations is going to go down, make sure you and your loved ones aren't anywhere near it. One aspect of defending yourself is being able to provide for your family. Imagine you disregard my advice and end up at one of these rallies because you want to speak your mind or speak out against the bad guys or whatever it is you think you're doing. And imagine someone catches you on camera, blast your name and address all over social media, people start sending you death threats, they go to your house, and then you have to explain to your employer why you were attending one of these highly controversial events. Would you want to do that? I certainly wouldn't. They even found some people that weren't even at the event and tried to blast them, and they had to defend themselves. So imagine if they actually do catch you at one of these things, and you are one of the quote-unquote fine people that the president talked about in his speech about this deal, his press conference. Even if you are a good person, why would you go to one of these things? It's just not a very good idea. I don't think it's going to be a smart thing for you to do that if you care about personal defense or your reputation as a citizen in this country. The First Amendment's a great thing, and I'm not telling you not to exercise your First Amendment rights. I'm just telling you to use common sense and be smart. There are better ways for you to use your First Amendment rights. You can write your congressman, you can start a blog, you can get on a podcast, you can do something besides going out to one of these dangerous demonstrations where violence is happening and potentially putting yourself and your reputation in serious danger. I promise you it's not worth it. Find a better way to get involved in the political stuff instead of going out to one of these things where you might get yourself hurt or killed, or at the very least have your name tarnished. That's your personal defense tip of the week. Thanks for tuning in.
Aaron Israel is a Personal Defense Network contributor and owner of Fundamental Defense. You can find out more and sign up for any of Aaron's classes at fundamentaldefense.com.
The percentage of women who own guns is growing. American women are more knowledgeable and better equipped to defend themselves than ever before. So, why is it that every time I go to a gun shop, I feel like they're talking down to me? Like, hey little lady, let me show you what you need. It's like all they want to do is sell me a pink gun. If you're tired of feeling that too, visit Guns for Gals, a specialty firearms boutique designed to empower women with information about firearm safety and to equip them with the means to protect themselves. The owners go out of their way to find products specifically for women, and they actually listen and ask questions to help you find the right products to meet your needs. If they wouldn't own it themselves, they won't sell it. Guns for Gals is located at 2035 Central Circle, Suite 108 in McKinney, Texas. Open Monday 1 to 6 and Tuesday through Thursday 11 to 7. And on weekends, you can find them at a gun show near you. Or shop online at www.gunsforgals.com. Guns for Gals, more than just a gun shop. It's how gun shopping should be.
Up next, we're clinging to God and guns with Pastor John Bennett.
This is Pastor John Bennett, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to talk today about our duty to our neighbor, the moral intersect of our duty to our family versus our duty to our neighbor, and also how that works into self-defense and just basic common sense. Now, this all comes about because of a rather unnerving experience I had about 2 weeks ago. As I was sitting up late at night watching television with my wife, 10:45 at night, the doorbell rang. Now, out here in the country where I live, no one comes to your door at 10:45 at night unless you're expecting a visitor. I wasn't prepared for this. You know, when it comes to self-defense scenarios, we try and think of every possible scenario and prepare ourselves mentally for that. Well, as I look through the curtain over the front door, I see a thin man with a hoodie on, and against my better judgment, I open the door. Now, part of that is because, well, I'm the pastor. The house is right next to the church. It's not uncommon to have people just stop by because they're lost and trying to find out where to go because they ended up in the middle of the country and they need directions. Well, anyway, I opened the door, and this young man, maybe in his mid-20s or so, gave me a story. He had been with a friend. They were moving some stuff from one small town to another. They got in a big argument. His friend was driving crazy, swerving all over the road. Stuff was falling out of the trailer, etc. And he needed a ride. And the place he needed to ride to is a town that was 15 miles away. Well, things just didn't seem right. In this day and age, what young person in their mid-20s doesn't have a cell phone, for one? How could he not call a friend and ask for a ride? He said he'd been walking for about 20 minutes. Well, I walked my road many times, and 20 minutes will get you a mile and a half, depending on how fast you're walking. He was wearing sandals. You can't walk fast in sandals. I doubt he'd been walking for more than a mile. And where our house is, our road, it really isn't on the way to the town where he was going. It was out of the way. He just needed a ride, desperate, was even willing to pay me for it. And so I said to him, I really don't feel comfortable doing this. And I was really torn. I really wanted to help him. And I said, I'll tell you what. If you go ahead and start walking, I'll discuss this with my wife. And if she's okay with it, then I'll come in the car and I'll come get you and give you a ride. And after that, I locked the door, began talking to my wife. I was just about ready to do it. Changed my clothes. I got my pistol just to be careful, to be safe. And then I started thinking about, how could this go wrong? If he pulls a knife and starts stabbing me before I can manage to get my pistol out, what good is that pistol going to do me? If I leave and he's got a buddy waiting around the corner to come in and rob the place after I leave, how does that protect my wife and my children who are asleep in bed? How can I help him while also doing what makes sense? Now, before I get to the conclusion on this, let's talk about this from a biblical perspective. We have this directive in God's Word to be good to our neighbor, to love our neighbor, to help our neighbor, and so forth. And this is where I was truly conflicted. Here I tell the guy I'm the pastor. Does that mean I am obligated to risk my safety, the safety of my family, in order to help this person who, let's face it, I had no idea who he was? And I had never envisioned this kind of a scenario, and I hadn't thought through what are the possible ways that I can be loving my neighbor while also doing the responsible thing in regards to my safety and the safety of my family. Well, we have the parable of the Good Samaritan, where a young man asks Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. This is what's written in the law." And the young man asks, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan, where a Jewish man on his way on the road was assaulted and left for dead. And two Jewish people who were upstanding members of society, who were part of the ruling Jewish religious class, they see the man and they can't be bothered, and they pass by the road on the other side. And then the Samaritan comes along, and he does the good thing, where he helps the man. He puts him on his own animal. He bandages his wounds. He takes him to the local tavern, which was also the place where people would stay for the night and so forth, and tells the innkeeper that he will pay for all the man's care and so forth, and if anything else is owed when he comes back, he'll pay the balance. That is a tall order for us, to go out of our way to love our neighbor. So how can we love our neighbor in these situations where doing what would be the right thing, the Christ-like thing, isn't necessarily the smart thing or the responsible thing? It's sad because we live in a day and age where it's not worth taking the risk anymore. We hear too many horror stories. Perhaps those kinds of horror stories that we hear are no more frequent today than they were 100 years ago. It's just that we have the internet to tell us about things that happen all over the country. So how do you love your neighbor? When loving your neighbor means putting yourself at risk. You know, there's a passage from the Epistle of James that really speaks to my heart. It was one of the things that was going through my mind as I was contemplating what to do as I was about to walk out the door and get in my car and follow him and give this guy a ride home. James chapter 4, verse 17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And that's where I was so torn that night. It's a 15-mile walk. Even at a fast pace, if a person manages to do a mile in 15 minutes walking, it would have taken him hours to get home. But at the same time, what was the right thing to do, to put myself at risk and give him a ride, or to endanger my life and perhaps the life of my wife and children? It was a lose-lose situation. Either I do not help him, or I help him and endanger my family. So what did I do? Well, rather than do nothing, I decided to call 911. It was the only thing that I could think of at the moment. And so I called 911. I told them what had happened. I told them the young man's story, and I asked, if there's any deputies in the area. And here in our area, 911 goes to the county sheriff dispatch. If they had any deputies in the area, could they just drive down the road and look for him and give him a ride? Because I didn't feel comfortable doing that. I didn't want to put myself at risk and didn't want to put my family at risk. And the dispatcher, very polite, said that she would send out a call. Well, after about an hour, I was unable to sleep at that point, just worried for the young man and generally freaked out. I called back to 911. I just wanted to update. And after talking to the dispatcher, the sheriff had followed that road all the way to the county line, and that county line is where the road would have been for him to walk towards home. It's 5 miles from my house to the county line. Within an hour's time, it would have been nearly impossible for him to walk that distance, and the deputy had driven out about a half hour after I had made the initial call, and the deputy saw no one. I have no idea what ever happened to that young man. If he was truly in need of help, it sounds like he got a ride. If he was up to no good, perhaps I made the right call. But I still didn't do nothing. I helped him. I did what I thought was best while protecting my family. Now, we can't envision every possible scenario where we might be putting ourselves at risk or which we might be in danger. But after some reflection, I realized what would have been the perfect solution. I have an old minivan that's a hunk of junk, and it's just the spare car in case something breaks down. I could have just handed him the keys and said, "See that van? Leave it in the gas station parking lot with the key on the visor, lock the door. I'm going to take a picture of your ID. If it's not there in the morning, I'll call the cops." But I hadn't thought that far ahead. I wasn't thinking clearly because the pressure was on in an unexpected, unprecedented situation. So if you ever find yourself in a situation, hopefully not like this, but where you just don't know what to do, stop, think about it, and for the love of God, pray about it, that God would give you wisdom to do the right thing in that situation. We never know when in life we're going to be called upon to help our neighbor. Did I do the right thing? It's hard to say. But at the same time, I didn't do the irresponsible thing. Well, that's all for now. I hope you learned something today, or perhaps at least gave you something to think about, that when it comes down to it, sometimes doing the right thing means doing the responsible thing. God's blessings to you all.
John Bennett is the pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. For more information, visit stjohnswillowcreek.org.
As many of you know, Sergeant Bill and I are competitive shooters. We're also reloaders. Bill helped me to get started last year, but I've still got a lot to learn. One thing I do know, though, you need a good source for supplies and components. So let me tell you about U.S. Reloading Supply. Yeah, there are bigger suppliers out there, but what sets U.S. Reloading Supply apart from the rest is their dedication to customer satisfaction. Check them out at usreloadingsupply.com. They carry the top name brands like Starline, Rainier, Barry's, Remington, Spear, and Hornady. If you've got a special order like primers and powder that you don't see on their website, give them a call for a quote. I did and got a great price. Excellent customer service, fast delivery, prices that include shipping, and a promise to match or beat any retailer's price, including shipping. Call them today, 941-451-7357, or visit them today at usreloadingsupply.com and use the promo code Lutheran2017 to save 10% off your order. usreloadingsupply.com.
Time now for another Ballistic Minute with Sergeant Bill Silvia.
Hey, I'm Sergeant Bill, and this is your Ballistic Minute. Today I'm going to talk about pre-stage rituals. So what I call pre-stage ritual is the things you do just before you shoot the stage. Now, I don't mean all the, planning and reviewing and going over your stage plan and all that stuff. I mean, right when you step up, you're the next shooter, they call you to the line. Now, one of the things that I do is I check all the mags on my belt before they call me up to the line, just to make sure that they're all loaded to the right number of rounds that they're supposed to be. There's a reason for this, because I have finished a stage and put an unloaded mag back in my pouch and didn't reload it. Thought, oh, it's in my pouch, it's good to go, and shot a stage and didn't have the ammo I'm supposed to have. Learned that lesson. So at load and make ready, I'll load and make ready. When I load, put the magazine in, I'll rack the slide to put a round in the chamber, and then I'll press check it to make sure that that round is in the chamber. Then I'll pull the magazine back out of the gun, double check that it has the right amount of rounds in it. So if I'm shooting, most IDPA divisions are 10 rounds in the mag, 1 in the gun, I just do that last double check to make sure there's 10 in there. Reinsert, I'll tap the mag base plate to make sure it's seated, and then I'll tap the back of the slide so that I make sure that the gun is in battery. Learned that lesson before. Shooting Glock 19 has a little bit heavier spring than a 17 and a lighter slide, so I had loaded it, and I guess I rode the slide forward, didn't quite go into battery. It was awful close, I didn't notice it. Drew and went to shoot and didn't do anything, did a tap rack and kicked a round out and was back in the game. But tapping the back of the slide, making sure it's in battery, especially on smaller guns, is just a good habit. And then last but not least, I'll take a deep breath, calm myself, center myself, get ready to execute my plan. And then they'll say stand by, and it's go time. Now, when I shoot a stage, whether it's a club match or a sanctioned match, I do pretty much the exact same thing every time. And I also try to do it quickly. I don't rush through it, but I don't want to take a whole lot of time. Now, you'll see some shooters that'll take a long time doing this pre-stage ritual that really has no reason except for them stalling because they're going back over their plan another time, another repetition of it, or trying to calm themselves or whatever it may be. They put their hand on their gun, take it back, put their hand on their gun, take it back. The whole point of a pre-stage ritual is that it's the same so that you have continuity, that you start out with confidence, doing the exact same thing every time you shoot so that you're ready to go. And think about the people shooting behind you. It should be quick. Don't stand up there and take a bunch of time. This isn't golf. Even though I used to play golf and I didn't take a whole lot of time. You line it up and step up there and swing. So what's your pre-stage ritual? What do you do? And do you do the exact same thing every time? If you don't, figure something out. do the exact same thing every time, because it'll give you that continuity so that every time you shoot a stage, you're starting out right where you want to be. I'm Sergeant Bill, and this has been your Ballistic Minute.
Sergeant Bill Silvia is a 15-year veteran of the Dallas Police Department and masterclass competitive shooter. You can watch Sergeant Bill's shooting videos at armedlutheran.us/Sergeant Bill.
If you carry a gun for personal protection, it's imperative that you get a good holster. When I started out, I had no idea what that meant, and I went through a bunch of really bad holsters. Then I found Cook's Holsters at cooksholsters.com. Cook's Holsters are custom made to fit your specific firearm. Available in lots of colors, including custom printed Kydex. Cook's Holsters are made in the USA and the great state of Georgia and come with a lifetime warranty against defects and a 100% satisfaction guarantee. Visit www.cooksholsters.com and use the promo code ARMEDPODCAST and get a 15% discount off everything in the store. You put a lot of time and money into the firearm you choose to carry for personal protection. Carry it in the best holster. cooksholsters.com.
Where gun culture meets the gospel, this is Armed Lutheran Radio.
Since the FBI shootout in Miami in 1986, the revolver was gradually retired from use by police departments and federal agencies around the country. Unless, of course, you're Rick Grimes from The Walking Dead, you'll still find lots of old-timers who don't trust those newfangled autoloaders, and they still say things like, the only real gun is a wheel gun. While semi-autos are tools, revolvers are kind of like works of art. They're elegant, they're iconic. Today's guest is one of the first names that comes to my mind when I think of revolvers. He's an instructor, an expert on the subject of defensive revolvers. He's been an acclaimed gunsmith, author of several popular books. One of them, the Gun Digest book of the revolver, I just arrived on my doorstep today. He writes regularly for Concealed Carry Magazine and Gun Digest, and like our own Aaron Israel, he's a Personal Defense Network contributor. Grant Cunningham, welcome to Armed Lutheran Radio.
Well, thanks for having me on.
I really am honored to have you on the show. Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a little bit of background as an instructor, as an author. How did you go from gunsmithing to instruction and writing?
Well, interestingly enough, the teaching actually came first, but I started out like a lot of people, I think, using guns on the farm where I grew up. So I was always around them and always used them and that kind of thing. And in the early 1990s, I got interested in the firearm as a personal defensive tool. And there was nothing in particular that spurred that. It was an interest. And so I started really studying defensive shooting. And after a while, people who were also interested in that sort of thing asked me to teach them what I knew. And that's how the teaching thing started. I started off buying semi-auto pistols when I turned 21. And when I got interested in defensive shooting, I didn't want a revolver. In fact, when I was a kid, right, playing, you play like kids play, I don't know, cowboys, Indians, that kind of thing. Right. I didn't want to do that because they had revolvers and lever action rifles. I wanted a 45 auto and an M1 carbine because I had seen that, in the war movies. That's what I wanted. Right. So I walked into a store one day and a very persuasive gentleman behind the counter convinced me to buy a revolver, and I went out and started shooting it. And I couldn't hit the broadside of the barn with the darn thing. And so that just made me want to learn all about revolvers. So here in the mid to late 1990s, I'm shooting revolvers almost exclusively because I really wanted to learn how to run them and how to make them work. And I had bought a couple more revolvers. I bought a Colt Python, as a matter of fact. And I thought that the Python's action could be a little better. So I started looking around for somebody to work on it. And I couldn't find anybody. All the gunsmiths around told me that they were just too complicated to work on. Well, keep in mind, I came out of the jewelry industry. I was the youngest licensed watch and clockmaker in the state of Oregon at one point.
Wow.
And a gun is not nearly as complicated as the stuff I was used to working on. So I did an action job on my Python. And one time I happened to be out shooting with Masad Ayub, and he tried my Python. He thought it was really great, and he wrote an article about it. And before you know it, I had a gunsmithing business and this is about 2001, I think. And all of a sudden people were just clamoring to have me work on their guns. And I put teaching aside and started working on the guns. And during this period of time, I put up a website for that business, and I started writing a blog. And so I'm writing these articles on the blog. I keep writing. And one day I got an email from an editor at Gun Digest, a fellow who unfortunately is no longer with us, but he sent me this email. He says, "Hey, would you like to write a book?" And that's how my writing career started. And it just kind of went from there. So it was kind of defensive shooter, competition shooter, right, to teacher, to gunsmith, to writer, and then back to teaching in the early 2000s. So it wasn't a linear sort of progression. It just kind of happened.
I got to ask this, where does the tactical hippie moniker come from? I've got to know. Somebody, a friend of mine once referred to me as, we had talked a little bit, and I kind of have a holistic view of self-defense in the shooting world. And I am an Oregonian, and even the most conservative Oregonians are hippies at heart. And so he dubbed me the tactical hippie, and he made a logo for it with a tie-dyed swirl with me sitting in a lotus position. And then it kind of went from there. All right. Well, let's talk about revolvers. As I mentioned earlier, law enforcement's moved away from revolvers, but if you read any discussion board on the subject or comments posted on your articles, you'll find tons of people who still own and trust their lives to revolvers. What is keeping the revolver alive? Is it nostalgia? Is it misconceptions about the reliability of semi-autos? Are they just still viable for self-defense?
I think it depends, of course, on the person, but I think there are a lot of things going on all at the same time with different people. And in the revolver classes that I teach, I see a pretty broad sort of cross section of people. For some people, yes, there's some nostalgia involved with it. And for others, you're correct in that there's sometimes an erroneous belief that the revolver is substantially or, say, order of magnitude more reliable than the auto-loading pistol. That isn't true anymore, depending on, as long as you're not buying a 1911. But anyway, I digress.
The hate mail will be coming now.
Oh yeah. Trust me, you're going to get hate mail from 1911 owners like crazy by the time I'm done here.
Between you and Aaron Israel, it's just
yeah. And like I tell people, John Moses Browning, great guy, but he wasn't talented enough to build a revolver, and we'll just leave that there. Anyway, so I think that there is some nostalgia. I think there is this sometimes mistaken idea that the revolver is more reliable. I think in some cases there is, for a lot of the people that I run into and a lot of people I teach, there is a desire for something that has a simpler manual of arms. Mm-hmm. Not that these people are stupid, but there is a desire to have something that is simpler to operate, simpler to deal with. That's part of it.
Right.
And there is also that group of people who recognize that the revolver is, although a lot of people will claim otherwise, the revolver is a very concealable arm simply because it has a very organic shape. It's round. Mm-hmm. The grip area is rounded. And so it sort of disappears under clothing where the sharp corners and edges of the auto pistols sometimes print. So there's a whole range of things going on there, depending upon the person.
Also, you'll often hear instructors or salesmen, typically salesmen, harking back to the guy who sold you your first revolver, recommending revolvers for new shooters, for women, for people who have, grip strength issues or trouble manipulating the slide of a semi-auto. Is that good advice? Are revolvers a good choice for new shooters, for women?
Before we get too far along here, the reason I bought that first revolver is because it was a deal and I'm a cheapskate. But let's get that out in the open. I think that's generally fairly bad advice for a couple of reasons. First of all, racking a slide in a semi-auto pistol is not a matter of strength, it's a matter of technique. And if you don't understand the technique and how to use leverage and mechanics to do it, which most men don't. We rely on brute strength. We don't rely on mechanics all that much. Then they won't be able to teach that person standing in front of them to do it properly. And when they can't do it, they'll say, well, maybe you should get a revolver. There are a few people out there, and I've certainly encountered them, who do have an issue, a body strength issue that prevents them from racking the slide, or a hand strength issue that prevents them from racking the slide of an autoloader. In most of those cases, if their strength problem precludes them from grasping and operating the slide of an autoloader, they almost always also have problems with the heavy double action trigger on a revolver. So it's not generally a very good recommendation unless you know specifically what you're dealing with.
And we live in an amazing time now with so many choices for guns, so much quality, so many, so the technology over the last 30 years has given us better and better and better guns and better ammo. Are those improvements helping to extend the longevity of the modern revolver for self-defense?
The revolver is a very mature technology, and firearms in general are mature technology, but particularly revolvers. And so what we're seeing is slow evolution in the design and manufacture of revolvers. What we're seeing is new materials being used to make them simultaneously lighter and stronger, and that kind of thing. And occasionally there's something that's a little twist, a little different. I worked on a project with the Kimber company, the Kimber K6S revolver, which is a different packaging of a slightly different packaging of the revolver, something that's not been done before, which is a small 6-shot concealed hammer revolver for concealed carry. So and they called it an evolution, and it is truly an evolution, and that's where we are with the revolver market now. The revolvers, I think, on a whole, are probably as good, I think, as anything that was produced in the 1970s, certainly, and in some cases, much, much better, if we're talking about the major manufacturers. Right. Most of the guns today shoot to point of aim. We've got great ammunition that's going in these things now. And I think as a defensive tool, the revolver has never been as good as it is right now.
Well, you wrote in one of your books about the unappreciated advantages, you called it, of a revolvers. Can give us a kind of a taste of what those advantages are?
I sort of alluded to one of them earlier, and that was the organic shape of the gun. A lot of people focus on the width of the cylinder in terms of concealment, in terms of concealed carry, and they'll look at the width of the revolver and say, oh gosh, that's so wide, it's hard to
That's exactly what I was thinking,
conceal.
Because I found I started carrying, I bought a snubby, and I started carrying it just to get an idea of how it carries and how it conceals, and I've been amazed at just how easy and comfortable it is to carry and how easy it is to conceal.
Yeah, exactly. And I liken it, and I think I even said this in the book, I liken it to standing in front of a mirror with a dress shirt on, a button-up shirt, putting a couple of Legos in your shirt pocket and looking how they stick out, right? These are the ones that you haven't walked on yet, and take them out and put in a couple of marbles, and it's a lot harder to tell what the marbles are than it is to tell what the Legos are, because it's a round shape. It kind of just disappears. And I think that's a huge advantage. Most people, like you, the first time they go to conceal a revolver, they're amazed at how easily it just sort of disappears. And particularly those, because I carry an autoloader quite a bit of the time too, and it's a little harder to dress around the autoloader than it is the revolver. I think that's a huge one. I think one of the unappreciated advantages is that when the revolver is on your body, and if it's in a belt holster, for instance, or some other sort of holster that holds it next to the body, the cylinder takes up some space so that there's a little bit of a gap between your body and the grip of the gun, which doesn't occur with an autoloader. The autoloader's flat, everything's up against your body. With the revolver, there's a space there, which makes it easy to get your hand around the grip, get your thumb down behind the grip, get your rest of the hand around the grip, and it makes it a little easier to get out of the holster when you need to. And it's especially the concealed hammer versions have the advantage of really coming out of a pocket very, very easily. Again, because of that and the streamlined shape and that kind of thing. So those are a couple of really overlooked advantages that I think most people are surprised to find.
As I said, I've added a couple to my collection recently just to start learning on. And a lot of people probably think, hey, a gun is a gun. You just point and pull a trigger, but it's really not that simple, is it? I mean, it's a whole different beast. But talk briefly about the differences. What makes the revolver so different to shoot?
Well, I've often said, and I've repeated this many, many times, that the revolver is perhaps the easiest handgun in the world to shoot. You simply pull the trigger. It's at the same time the most difficult to shoot well, right, because you're dealing with a long, heavy trigger. Now, with the exception of the traditional double action automatic pistols, the ones that are double action for the first shot and single action after that, every other auto-loading pistol that you find has a trigger that is much lighter than the revolver and has a much shorter travel than the revolver does. In some cases, maybe in the single actions, maybe like the 1911s and things like that, it may be a 32nd of an inch, maybe a 16th of an inch of travel before the gun fires. With the revolver, it's like 3/4 of an inch. And where the auto-loading pistol is, 6-7 pounds on it would be really, really heavy in a lot of cases. The revolver generally comes out of the box at about 12 pounds on average these days. So you've got a trigger that is both heavier and has a much longer travel than the auto-loading pistol. So you need to learn to deal with that. And you have to maintain a consistent application of force over a relatively long distance to avoid moving the gun in your hand, having the trigger finger move the gun or steer the gun, as I say. And it's much, much harder with a revolver to do that because you've got a lot of pressure that you have to apply over a long period of time and a long travel. With the auto-loading pistol, virtually all of them, that's not the case. They're much easier to shoot. They're much easier to shoot well, I should say. The exception is that traditional double-action auto-loading pistol, which has a long, heavy travel for that first shot. And in that aspect, they're a lot like a revolver, at least for the first shot. But for everything else is much easier to shoot. It requires some discipline. It requires a little bit of hand strength to shoot a revolver. And I certainly run into people in classes, particularly when we're shooting 200 or 300 rounds a day, that are not used to doing that over a long period of time. And they get tired. And so we have to make time to let people's fingers sort of wake up again. So it does require some dedication, it does require some hand strength, and it does require an attention to technique. Rob Latham is famous for saying, he slaps his trigger on his competition 1911. He literally slaps the things. And as long as you're holding that auto-loading pistol nice and tight, you can slap the trigger and it'll be just fine. You can't do that with a revolver. So you do have to pay a lot more attention to technique if you want to shoot.
Talk about that trigger pull, because I saw your video with Rob Pincus, and shooting a semi-auto, you tend to, or at least I tend to prep and press the trigger as I'm shooting, and you cannot do that with a revolver at all.
There was a period of time in this country when the prevailing wisdom amongst the top, say, law enforcement trainers, and this is long before concealed carry became a reality for most of the United States. So we're talking the 1930s through about the 1950s or 60s. There was this prevailing notion that you could not shoot a double-action revolver accurately. And so the recommendation was to only use double action if you were, as the saying goes, belly to belly with the bad guy. And for everything else, you cocked it to single action, because single action on a revolver is very, very easy and very nice to shoot. And as we learned more about the mechanics of double action shooting and a lot of really great pioneers that looked at the double action shooting said, we can actually do this. And we started to develop technique for dealing with the double action trigger. And it starts with a continuous application of pressure on the trigger. So there are some people today that will stage the trigger. They'll pull the trigger 3/4 of the way through, then stop, and realign their sights and then do the remainder of the pull, kind of a prepping the trigger or staging the trigger, as it's often called. And what we've learned is that doesn't really work all that well. And so what we teach now is a continuous application of pressure and moving that trigger at a constant speed all the way back until the gun fires. That's the first key, is applying enough pressure that the trigger moves at a constant speed as it goes back, not slowing down or stopping or anything like that. So that's the first most important aspect. The second is the notion that your trigger finger does not move straight back. It's hinged in 3 places, as a matter of fact. And so it doesn't describe a straight line as it moves. It describes, interestingly enough, a decreasing radius curve is what it does. And the trigger on the revolver is hinged. It pivots on a pin, and it also does not move in a straight line. It moves up as it goes back relative to the frame. And so what happens is that people will shoot the revolver, and to a lot of people, if they're not used to it, it feels like the trigger is getting away from them because it's sliding up and back, and the finger's sliding across, all kinds of things. And so what they tend to want to do is sort of grab onto the trigger with their trigger finger, try to move it straight back. And what usually happens there, they end up steering the gun around, and then when their trigger finger hits the frame of the gun, as it inevitably does, it steers the gun in a different direction. That's when they have to stage the trigger and stop and do all that. So now what I teach people to do is to simply let your finger slide on the trigger. It's going to slide no matter what you do. If you simply accept that, all of a sudden you can apply pressure on the trigger, force on the trigger, and not move the gun as it goes back. So those are the 2 fundamentals that we talk about in terms of trigger control. Of course, it all starts with a strong grasp on the gun. Everything is dependent upon a strong grasp of the gun. And so we usually end up starting out with that, teaching people how to get their maximum grasp pressure on the gun, and then proceeding with trigger control after that. And those things all have to go together to make shooting a revolver well work.
And the grip is very different as well. You can't do the typical, fit your offhand in and thumbs forward. It just doesn't work the same way.
It's interesting because back in the 60s and 70s, and the auto pistol really started taking off in police use in the late 70s and 80s. And before then, everybody knew how to grasp a revolver, and they grasp it and they get their strong hand around it, curl their thumb down, layer the fingers of their support hand over the fingers of the shooting hand, and then they use their thumb of their support hand to press down on the thumbnail of the shooting hand. And that was a typical revolver grasp with there's a few variations depending upon hand size. And that was the revolver grip. And then when the law enforcement really started moving into shooting autoloading pistols, they taught that. In fact, there are still some instructors out there who teach that thumbs down grip for the autoloading pistol because that's what they taught for the revolver, and so that's what they taught, right? And it wasn't really until I think probably the 1990s when the competition world started really looking at the most efficient way to grasp a pistol to control it, and they came up with the layered thumbs or thumbs forward grip. And so that dominated competition because it works so well. And so now we have a situation where people who grew up shooting autoloading pistols are now teaching people to shoot a revolver with their thumbs layered and forward like that, which doesn't work very well, and sometimes gets their fingers singed in the meantime. But it's sort of the same thing in reverse. Well, we do it with autoloading pistols, so we're going to do it with a revolver. No, you can't do that. And so I teach 2 different grasps for the autoloading pistol and the revolver: thumbs layered and forward on the autoloading pistol, thumbs curled down and locked into place on the revolver. And that also takes advantage of the unique mechanics of the 2 guns. On the autoloading pistol, we have a tang or a beaver tail that sits over the web between our thumb and forefinger, and that arrests a lot of the muzzle flip that occurs. It channels it into that muscle and keeps the muzzle flip down. And the thumbs forward grip really takes advantage of that because it lifts that muscle up and thickens it a little bit, so it's up tight against the tang of the gun, and there's no gap there, and so you get maximum recoil control. We don't have that on the revolver. So if you layer your thumbs on a revolver, what happens is the gun tends to shift downward. It kind of rolls downward in your grasp, and you'll see a lot of people who are trying to shoot thumbs forward on a revolver. They're having to readjust their grasp all the time because the gun is sliding. And what happens is, if we curl our thumbs down and get a constriction between our thumb and the middle finger of the shooting hand, that keeps the grip frame of the revolver from sliding downward in the hand. So we use the two different grasps to take advantage of the two very different shapes and designs of the guns.
And you said in that video I mentioned with Rob Pincus that mastering the trigger pull on a revolver will make you a better shooter with semi-auto pistols as well. What did you mean by that?
I think that, first of all, we learn trigger control better, and I think most good revolver shooters have an innate understanding of trigger control that some autoloading shooters don't. The other thing that I think is really important and is that with a revolver, when you release the trigger to reset it, the trigger is always in motion in a revolver. It's either going forward or going backwards, one or the other. And so when you start shooting, the idea is to keep that trigger in motion all the time with no downtime. And so revolver shooters have to get a lot better at resetting the trigger because they, again, just like we had to travel 3/4 of an inch to get the gun to fire, now we have to travel 3/4 of an inch to get it reset. And so revolver shooters get really, really good at resetting triggers. And more importantly, resetting triggers without relaxing their grasp. Most people, one of the things I see very, very commonly to people who are new to revolvers is that as they reset the trigger, the grasp loosens a little bit because, again, our fingers are sympathetic, right? So as you release the trigger finger, the others want to relax as well. And so revolver shooters have to learn how to maintain that grasp through trigger compression, trigger release. And that's something a lot of autoloader shooters don't do. They don't have to pay attention to that. And so they discover that when they have been shooting revolvers for a while and have gotten used to that, all of a sudden they're resetting the trigger on their autoloader without relaxing the muscles of their hand. And all of a sudden they're able to shoot faster and to a higher degree of precision than they could before. And I think that's a very big contribution, is understanding that reset.
All right, we've talked about the advantages of the revolver. So what are the downsides? What are the common complaints about the defensive revolver, and are those complaints warranted?
Well, of course, the first thing we deal with is the reduction in capacity.
Right.
So compared to a compact autoloading pistol, which might, depending upon the design and caliber, might carry anywhere from 12 to about 13 rounds is real common. The subcompacts will carry 8, 9,
6, 7, 8,
very
9,
commonly. Yeah. And so the revolver very typically is going to carry 5 or 6 in the vast majority of incarnations, at least the ones that are concealable and carryable. And so there is that reduction in ultimate capacity. Is that an issue? Well, it depends upon how you look at the problem.
Right.
In reality, the defensive shootings that I look into very rarely require, and this is an important word, require more than 3 to 5 rounds. I mean, it's unusual to find one that doesn't. Right. That's not to say that they don't happen, but it's just that they're very unusual. So the reduction in capacity of the revolver would seem to be a significant downside, but in reality, it just doesn't really turn out that way in the real world. We don't see a lot of cases where people have shot their revolvers dry and had a negative outcome in the fight. It really doesn't happen. And it's very, very hard to find situations where it has. So that's the first downside. And again, there are people who will argue this, because you can find situations, particularly in police service, that have gone, 11, 12, 13 rounds. It's the other thing about the revolver is that it requires a lot more dexterity to reload.
Right.
It requires that you line up 5 or 6 individual rounds with 5 or 6 chambers in the cylinder to get the thing reloaded. So it's a very dexterity intensive task. I think, again, the heavy trigger, that's a downside for a lot of people, particularly if you've got hand strength issues. So I think those are, by and large, most of them. Most of the rest of the problems that people run into deal with individual gun models. For instance, the very small compact revolvers typically have really, really, really awful sights.
Right.
and so that's kind of a problem, and things like that. But the lack of capacity, the reloading, and I think the final thing is the increased recoil,
right?
Because the revolver doesn't have mechanism to soak up the energy that comes back into the hand in recoil, and so for any given level of power out of the muzzle, the gun's going to recoil more. So I think those are the main ones.
Malfunctions is one of the areas that we train for with semi-auto pistols. We practice malfunction drills, and it's one of the things that people who love revolvers will say, "Oh, there are no malfunctions. They never malfunction." Malfunctions are rare, but they're not impossible, and most of them are user-induced. What are some of the potential malfunctions that you could run into?
Most of the time, if the revolver stops operating, I think if we look at it sort of in an aggregate, the revolver in general will have fewer malfunctions over a given period of time than the autoloader will, but the malfunctions are such that the gun, you're not going to fix it,
right?
In the context of
now it's a club.
So now it's a club. So most of the problems that you have with the revolver boil down to really just a few areas. One, bad maintenance. So for instance, on Smith & Wesson revolvers, the ejector rod can unscrew, and that will bind up the cylinder and make it impossible to get the cylinder open. And that's a maintenance issue. And so the gun has to be maintained. The side plate screws coming out. I think most people are used now. Most autoloading pistols, when you think about it, most autoloading pistols don't have any screws. Right. Revolvers have a bunch of them. You have to keep the area underneath the ejector, the star or the ratchet, as Colt calls it. You have to keep that clean, because if a unburned piece of powder gets under there, it will push that out just enough that when the cylinder tries to rotate in the frame, it drags and it binds up, and you can't pull the trigger. Again, that's a matter of you got to keep that area clean. And of course we deal with ammunition issues just as we do in the autoloaders, and the problems. A lot of the problems are the same with tying the gun up. If you get a squib load in an autoloader, you're going to tie the gun up. If you get it in a revolver, you're going to tie the gun up. Those are fairly equal. The rest of them are really user induced. And the first most common one deals with, we go back to that trigger reset idea, that if you don't reset the trigger fully, the gun in some cases will either lock up when you try to pull the trigger again, or spin the cylinder and skip around when you do it, depending upon the gun. The biggest issue, I think, is problems that stem from reloading technique, because it's very easy to mess up a reload in a revolver and tie the gun up. And what happens is if you don't get all of the empty cases ejected, it's possible for one to stay in there and slip underneath the extractor. And now you can't reload the gun, you can't close the gun, you can't do anything with it until you get that casing out. And that takes time and realistically, in most cases, a tool, not much of a tool, a pencil, but it still requires time. And this can be mitigated through proper reloading technique.
So let's talk about your latest book that came out, last month. It's called Prepping for Life. This is a little different book for you, but you're not talking about this reality TV style hoarding canned goods in your basement kind of thing.
This really came about from my own experiences. The tendency is that when we start talking, for instance, people who are really into guns, really focus all on the guns. And so we see a lot of people who go to a lot of gun classes, learn how to shoot, and they've got lots of guns around the house and that kind of thing, but they don't have a first aid kit. or they don't have pepper spray, or they don't have any unarmed skills. It's important to understand that the defensive firearm is a very, very efficient tool, but it's applicable in a very, very, very narrow range of circumstances. And so we have to be prepared for a lot of other things that don't necessarily need the gun. And then if we were to look at it honestly, the thing that's going to kill most of us isn't the bad guy with the switchblade. It's it's the heart attack. or the car accident. And so when I started looking at personal security in a much broader context, it became obvious that all of this stuff, the learning how to defend yourself with a firearm, learning how to stop traumatic bleeding, learning how to can food, and all of this other stuff, it was all part of a whole. We do all this stuff because we want to live longer, happier lives. And so I use that in my own life. How do I prepare? Okay, great. If I'm not going to go off the rails with the guns, I really don't want to go off the rails with like buying MREs and sticking them in my basement or something like that. So the whole idea is, how do we prepare to extend our lives and maintain a decent life and a decent, happy life and all that kind of thing? Well, what can we do? Okay, well, let's take a reasonable view of everything. But then it kind of came down to, well, what do I do first? Well, let's look at the problems we face, the threats we faced, and we'll rank those, how often they happen and how bad they are. And then we'll prepare for the most likely, most dangerous stuff first and work our way down. And once we're done with that, we'll go on to the next thing. And that's how that whole book came about. And that's why the subtitle for it is The Balanced Approach to Personal Security and Family Safety, because that really is what it's all about. I tell people it's kind of like an onion, right? So all of these layers on the onion protect the center of it. Well, all the layers that we're doing protect us. And so all this stuff in all directions, and we do reasonable things. And in the book, I give a framework of how to achieve that.
Talk about Training Talk on PDN. Tell people a little about what Training Talk is about.
Training Talk is the show on Personal Defense Network. We do it twice a month, the first and third Thursdays of every month. And we look at how a whole broad range of topics about how we can prepare and equip ourselves to face a worst case scenario. And so usually what I'll do is I'll have a guest on, usually one of our great Personal Defense Network contributors, and we'll talk about some of the stuff that they've done for Personal Defense Network. And we have a lot of very specific experts that are contributors at PDN. And so we get a really broad range of ideas of what we can do to keep ourselves and our families safe.
Grant Cunningham is a Personal Defense Network contributor, as we mentioned. He's an author, instructor, and maybe the foremost authority on the subject of the defensive revolver. His latest book, Prepping for Life, can be found on Amazon and his website, grantcunningham.com. You'll find a link to that in the show notes as well. And check out all his Training Talk videos at PDN as well. Grant, thank you so much for joining me today. We really appreciate having you here.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a great amount of fun for me.
And that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. Thank you for listening. Thank you to my wonderful cast of contributors, Sergeant Bill Silvia, Aaron Israel of Fundamental Defense, and Pastor John Bennett of St. John's Lutheran Church in Willow Creek, Minnesota. Mia Anstine is traveling. She'll be back with us again next week, Lord willing. And thank you to our special guest, Grant Cunningham, for joining us today. And thank you, dear listener, for joining us, for downloading and subscribing. Hope you enjoyed the show and you learned a lot. I hope you'll join us again next week. Until then, keep shooting, keep praying. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Armed Lutheran Radio. For show notes, be sure to visit our website at www.armedlutheran.us. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, and TuneIn. This podcast is made possible by Cook's Holsters and contributions from listeners like you.